Taking a look at implementation, there are a number of things about our government structure that affects the implementation process in the United States. The first is federalism, which decentralizes the process. And second of all, are the separation of powers, which are our three branches of government: Congress, the executive branch, and the courts. Let's take a little bit more in-depth look at both of these things. So federalism and implementation, if we take a look at basically the way things are divided up between the national and the state and local governments, and remembering that there's nothing in the federal constitution about local governments, but they are part of the partnership that we define as the American partnership. Many programs are specifically nationally oriented and implemented. So for example, for the most part, defense is a national program. Social Security is a national program where the money is collected by the federal government and then distributed to older Americans. Things like airline safety, particularly in a post 9/11 world, now that we've had airline security as well through the Department of Homeland Security, are things that are nationally implemented. Also, the regulation of banks through the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, which is a New Deal kind of agency, is something that's federal. But most of the large programs, I mean, they are large programs, and also Medicare should be up there as well. But there are quite a few programs that are really kind of jointly carried out by the states and the federal government in areas in which the federal government probably is on somewhat shaky constitutional grounds. In other words, these are certain powers that have been reserved to the states. The federal government can get involved in these programs, essentially by providing money to the states to carry them out. Education is kind of the biggest one of these, which has always been considered to be a local and a state function. Environmental protection, the federal government sets standards for environmental protection, but it's oftentimes the state governments that are the ones through their own agencies that carry these policies out. And also states are allowed, if they would like to, when it comes to environmental protection, they'll also have higher thresholds of protections than the federal government has. Transportation, there are really no federally owned roads. Even on the interstate highway system, these are really controlled primarily by state governments. Welfare policies, for the most part, are channeled through states and down through the county level, where they're implemented on a kind of a more local level. And of course, one of the ways that federalism scholars define whether or not you really have a federal country is whether or not law enforcement is actually carried out at the national level or at the local level. And surely in the United States, while we do have, law enforcement at the national level and the FBI, and, other kind of like the former ATF, which I can't remember what they're called now, organizations like that, most of our law enforcement is done at the local level. So that's something that's the federal government can make some policies about and help to fund, but it's really implemented at the state and local level. Now, when we have this kind of implementation by state and local governments for federal policy, how does this actually happen? So in these kind of what we call shared policies, the federal government generally provides some policy goals that they would like the states and the local governments to carry out. They have some standards that they develop for how they are going to evaluate these programs and how they're run by state and local bureaucracies. Oftentimes, there will be situations in which there isn't actually the capability or what we call capacity for the state and local governments to be able to handle these problems. So there is some what we call technical assistance from the federal bureaucracies, which would reach down and help to train individuals at the state and local level on best practices and how to best carry out these policies. And then finally, the number one thing and what state and local governments are really interested in is that the federal government will provide financial assistance to the states to carry out these programs. And it's really the federal government's power to be able to tax through the income tax that really gives them the ability to be able to more or less force the states to carry things out on their behalf. Now, the states, local governments, they basically will implement the policy that the federal government asks for. They enforce it. And in some cases, as I mentioned, the federal government will set the floor for regulations, but states are allowed to have more strict regulations if that's something that's appealing to their political culture. So When we talk about federalism and implementation, again, we can kind of go to this macro versus micro level. At the macro level, basically the national government acts to be able to set a certain floor across the nation, certain kind of national standards that will force states to have a minimal basis of some sort of type of public policy action. And then at the micro level, it's really up to the states then to go down and make sure that that the proper behavior is being carried out. Now, one of the things that we talk about in the area of implementation is whether or not policy, the political arena actually ends at the policy adoption stage. And if you go back to classic public administration theory, the idea was that Congress and the president would engage in politics, and this would be something related towards, compromise and bargaining and log rolling and horse trading and all this. But then once the policy was actually passed in the implementation stage, what we would see would be that there would be no politics embodied in the implementation process. Bureaucracy would find the best way to carry out a public policy, and there would be no politics. So in other words, to use a very simple example, Congress would decide how to build, where we were supposed to build roads and where the interstates were going to be, but that there wasn't any really Republican or Democratic way to pave a road. There's only a best way to pave a road. And that's the classic public administration theory. But the reality is that it doesn't necessarily work that way. The bureaucracy is subject to the same political forces that any other public institution would be. And as we know from the Iron Triangle theory, they are also involved in making policy as well. So looking at the environment really that a bureaucratic agency is subjected to, we see that they're subjected to other agencies within the executive branch. They're subjected to the executive office of the president himself, who wants to carry out certain types of policies and achieve certain goals. So there's pressure on them to achieve those goals. And then you've got state and local governments, obviously, who are pressuring them as well. Congress, again, thinking about the Iron Triangle, congressional committees, but also when it reaches the level of macro politics, at that point, there will be some discussion between, some pressure on them from Congress. And then obviously, the interest groups are very interested in making sure that regulations and rulemaking is undertaken in a practice that's best and most advantageous to their clienteles. Now, the other kind of facet of our American governmental system that influences the way that this is carried out is the separation of powers. So, as I mentioned before, Congress often leaves the details to the bureaucracy. They provide a big overall goal of what they would like to achieve in a public policy, but oftentimes don't understand the technical details that are necessary to be able to carry this out. So, for example, particularly in relationship to scientific endeavors, there will oftentimes be a very wide latitude that Congress provides for agencies to be able to carry out rules. So, the Clean Air Act of 1970, the objective really set by Congress was that the EPA should go out and clean up our air, clean up pollution. But they gave them a wide latitude to do that and to determine when things when pollution should be stopped and when it was harmful to public health. And we saw this during the kind of Obama administration when they decided that, carbon emissions were a public health concern, and they moved to regulate carbon emissions, especially from coal-fired power plants. This was something that was undertaken by the bureaucracy, by the EPA, not by Congress. And they made the argument that they were endowed with that right as a consequence of the Clean Air Act. Another thing was President Reagan had the idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative back in the mid-1980s, an idea that we would be able to build a so-called Star Wars system where we would be able to plant some sort of weapons in space that could shoot down nuclear weapons from the Soviets. This was something that was, really in the developmental stage. So Congress passed and funded these programs, but really gave money to the Defense Department to be able to kind of create these things and fill in the pieces, right? So there's a lot of power, a lot of discretion given to executive agencies by Congress in trying to implement these policies. Now, a couple of things in relationship to the patterns of policymaking that we would see at the implementation stage and by bureaucracies. Basically, they have four primary patterns by the way that they go about kind of influencing public policy. We've mentioned rulemaking before. So, for example, OSHA, which is in charge of occupational safety, really is responsible for setting the safety standards for workplaces. They've been tasked by Congress to do so, and they're the ones that make these rules. The Securities and Exchange Commission is tasked with protecting investors and, as a consequence, regulates corporations and other businesses, telling what kind of information has to be made available to the public and regulating those industries. And then all of this is subjected to a period in which these rules are made, draft rules are made available to the public, and then the public has time to be able to discuss those rules and provide comments before the final rules are made, which makes the process a bit more democratic. Other ways that agencies engage in policymaking are through adjudication. So a good example of this is the National Labor Relations Board, which is basically set up to arbitrate between unions and businesses. They'll hear the facts of the case and determine which side is right in a dispute, and then determine what sort of penalties or what sort of compensation should be made. If you think about it, many law enforcement policies are on the book, but very much a matter of discretion of actually carrying out and implementing those policies, right? So law enforcement, for example, gets to decide when and how to enforce a law. Not everybody gets pulled over for running a red light or a traffic light. Not everybody gets a ticket every time they're pulled over. If we even think about, for example, the way that federal marijuana policy is being carried out at the state level, some states have actually allowed it to be legal, and some states like, or some cities like Philadelphia are actually, while it's not legal in Pennsylvania, are no longer kind of criminalizing it. They've decided just to give tickets out. So it's the wide discretion on how you're actually going to enforce the law for a lot of these different agencies, and particularly in their different administrations, there are different emphases on what should be enforced and what shouldn't. And finally, we have program operations. So how do you carry these things out in practice? So, for example, in national parks, one thing that's been controversial in recent years is how to deal with fires. Should you attempt to be able to squelch every small fire, or should you attempt to let some things have controlled burns? And scientific evidence proves the different kind of aspects of that, and it's up to the National Park Service to be able to determine what's the most effective way to do all that to carry out their mission statement. So those are the overall kind of discussions of what we would see with the implementation process.